Well, sealed with a phone call? Well, the US president says he thinks there is, in his words, a very good chance he can broker an end to the war between Russia and Ukraine in a phone call with Vladimir Putin scheduled tomorrow. The Kremlin confirming just hours ago that that call will happen. In comments on Sunday, Donald Trump indicated the focus of the call will be about land concessions, potentially the biggest obstacle to reaching a ceasefire.
Be speaking to President Putin on Tuesday. I think we'll, be talking about land. It's a lot of land. It's a lot different than it was before the wars, And we'll be talking about land. We'll be talking about power plants. That's up, it's a big question. But I think we have a lot of it already discussed very much by both sides.
Busy flight, that. Well, exactly how the Russian president will respond is anyone's guess. In a news conference last week, Putin laid out tough conditions and demanded concessions from Kyiv before accepting the US peace plan. Well, CNN's Claire Sebastian joining us now from London. Elena Trine is at the White House. And Claire, we've just in the last few hours heard from the Kremlin that this call will happen. What are the expectations on the part of Vladimir Putin in what he might get out of this?
Well, Becky, I think this is potentially a unnerving, if not perilous, moment for Ukraine, right? Because Ukraine had a very positive week last week after the talks in Saudi Arabia. US military aid was restored. It seemed like their relationship with their biggest backer was getting back on track. I think for Putin, this call this week represents an opportunity to reverse some of that progress, to try to drive a wedge again between the US and Ukraine. Don't forget, after the last time they spoke back on February 12th, it was a few days later, and of course we cannot prove causality here, but it was a few days later that we started to hear rhetoric coming from President Trump calling President Zelensky a dictator, and then we had that cascade of events that led up to the Oval Office meeting. So that is one aspect for Ukraine to keep an eye on, and of course Ukraine's European allies, the foreign ministers of which are meeting in Brussels today and are clearly, from the commentary that we heard from them going into that meeting, trying to reiterate the point that, of course, it is Russia, not Ukraine at this point, standing in the way of peace. But look, President Trump seems to be suggesting that a lot of work has been done ahead of this call, that there was work done over the weekend. He may have something to announce, but hedging, again, he said, on whether they can end this war. Maybe we can, maybe we can't. So I think for now, Russia is keeping officially its commentary very light, not commenting at all on what it expects from this meeting.
Elena, US Special Envoy Steve Witkoff was Trump's Sherpa, effectively. He said on CNN yesterday that he had a positive meeting with Putin last week. What more do we understand to have come out of that meeting?
Well, there's a few things, Becky. One, I was told that that meeting lasted several hours and actually went into the early morning of Friday. But then also that Witkoff left directly, and then over the weekend, he made a pit stop, I should say, in Azerbaijan, but then over the weekend came to Florida, where the president was at his Mar-a-Lago home, and briefed him on everything that happened. Now, clearly, the president is very much impressed and confident in what Witkoff shared with him in order for him to so publicly go out there and say that he believes that there's a good chance to ending the war. He believes that they've made progress through those discussions, and that he wants to physically and directly speak with Russian President Vladimir Putin himself tomorrow. Now, I think one of the most interesting things we've learned, and from what the president said himself directly to reporters on Air Force One, is that they're already starting to give us a little sense of what the conversation with Putin could look like. When the president said, and you played some of this, that he thinks that they'll be talking about land. A lot of land is different than it was before the war. That's really talking about some of the concessions and the physical geography of what these negotiations could include. We know, and this has been said repeatedly by United States officials, people like Secretary of State Marco Rubio, that they believe that both Ukraine and Russia are going to have to make concessions moving forward. We already know that Ukraine has kind of made those concessions when they met last week in Jeddah with the U.S. delegation, and that they agreed to that temporary ceasefire. The White House and its officials and the president himself have said that now the ball is in Russia's court. And so I think what they're going to be looking for out of these continued talks is what concessions are Russia and Vladimir Putin directly willing to make, and can they guarantee that? And that's really where a lot of this stems from. But it does seem like the White House is very confident with how these discussions have been going. I've been hearing that in my private conversations as well. And we'll just have to see how this goes tomorrow between the president, the United States President, President Trump, as well as Russian President Vladimir Putin tomorrow.
Yeah, who's the better negotiator at the end of the day? And one can only assume that the Russian president has a long game at the back of his mind. President Trump, it seems, perhaps looking at a sort of shorter time period here. It'll be interesting to see what comes out of this. It's good to have you both. Thank you very much indeed. Stephen, Donald Trump saying he thinks there's a good chance of a ceasefire coming out of this call. We know that Vladimir Putin has been and may be in this for the long game. We also know that Donald Trump is looking for a short-term win. In fact, he promised that this war would be over within the first 24 hours of his tenure. What do you make of what we are hearing out of both sides, the messaging at this point?
Yeah, I think that's a good point. The way that the Americans and the Russians are operating off a different timeline. I mean, President Putin's timeline probably stretches far beyond the point when Donald Trump will no longer be in the White House. The administration is very upbeat on its discussions with the Russians. On the one hand, I think that makes sense, because if you're involved in a diplomatic negotiation, you have to give the impression of progress to try and create momentum, even if there isn't really much progress. The caveat, of course, is that we don't know what's been going on behind the scenes in the granularity of these discussions with the Russians and with the Ukrainians. But at the same time, President Putin has effectively rejected Trump's call for an immediate ceasefire. That happened last week with all of these different conditions that the Russians applied. And although the US side says they agree on principle, it's clear, as you say, that the Russians are going to try and stretch these negotiations out because they're doing better on the battlefield right now than the Ukrainians. And I think there's a slight warning sign when the president is already talking about dividing up assets. These seem to be the questions that would be left for after a ceasefire and when a peace is being negotiated, a permanent peace. It seems a little bit getting the cart before the horse if they're talking about them now. And let's not forget, these assets that Trump is talking about, they're Ukrainian assets that were seized by Russia in an invasion. So I think there'll be concern in Europe that once again, Trump is leaning closer to the position of Putin than the Ukrainians.
Well, as the US and Russian presidents get ready for that phone call, European diplomats are talking about what role they can play. EU foreign ministers gathered in Brussels today to discuss providing more money for Ukraine's defence. Europe's increasingly strained relationship with the US was also on the agenda. The ministers remain sceptical that Russia is really ready to talk peace with Ukraine.
Well, those conditions that they have presented, it shows that they don't really want peace, actually, because they are presenting as conditions all their ultimate goals that they want to achieve from the war. There's a broad political support for that initiative, which is good, but there's a lot of details that need to be worked out, because there are also defense ministers that need to have a say, and we have a meeting of defense ministers, but it's important that the Council said that we need to move swiftly, and that is what we are doing.
To help us understand all the moves happening right now regarding Russia's war in Ukraine, we're joined by CNN political and national security analyst David Sanger. David, great to see you again. He's the author of The New Cold Wars, China's Rise, Russia's Invasion, and America's Struggle to Defend the West. David, really great to be speaking with you once again. We were hearing there much scepticism, I think, coming out of Brussels ahead of this call set to be held tomorrow. And, you know, one can understand why. How much risk does this call carry for Ukraine at this moment?
Well, thanks for having me on. It carries a lot of risk for Ukraine. It carries some risk for the Europeans who are meeting. They're not on the call, and neither are the Ukrainians. So, you know, we've heard from President Trump yesterday, as he was flying back on Air Force One, that he's going to have this call, and that when he does have the call, there will be discussion over how much territory Russia gets to hold on to, the fate of the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant. We assume that's the plant that he is discussing. And we've known, of course, for years that Russia would end up with some land that they seized illegally from this invasion and, of course, from the seizure of Crimea. The question isn't whether they end up with it. The question is, do the Ukrainians get a voice, an equal voice in this negotiation too? Or is this something that's just going to be decided between Vladimir Putin and President Trump? And right now, it looks like the latter.